The concerns about what a surveillance society would look like are not illegitimate or unfounded, right? We've seen other countries struggle with this. I'm glad we are people here in the United States who are focused on how do we use information effectively and how do we put the appropriate guardrails and controls over it to make sure it's heading in the right place. You've hit a great one. Airports, I think people generally recognize that they are covered entirely with CCTV, yet we still have people going up and doing very interesting things directly on TV.
Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
Welcome back to AI, Government in the Future. I'm your host, Max Romanek, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Patricia Cogswell to the show. Patricia is a distinguished leader in Homeland and National Security with over 28 years of experience in both government and the private sector. She's held significant roles in the White House, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice, specializing in areas like cybersecurity, counterterrorism, and transportation security. Currently as a partner at Guidehouse Federal, Patricia leverages her experience to drive innovative solutions in national security consulting, bridging commercial and government practices to tackle today's most complex security challenges. Today, we'll be exploring the essential role AI plays in identifying and addressing mission-critical challenges within national security. We'll also discuss how government oversight, regulation, and collaboration can enable AI to enhance public safety while ensuring ethical governance. Welcome to the show, Patricia.
Thank you very much.
So I'd like to start by giving our listeners a little bit of a glimpse into the journey that led you to Guidehouse and your focus on the intersection of technology and security.
I have to say, when I first thought about when was the first time I ever worked on the combination of technology and security, it was a really long time ago. And it took me a minute to actually think back that far. When I was pretty early in my career, right out of law school, I had the opportunity to serve on a team that was looking to re-engineer the naturalization program, the process by which people become U.S. citizens, in part, in not insignificant part, because of some deficits in how the security checks were being done. So we had to figure out how to collect information differently, how to transmit them to the various organizations who ran the checks for us, how we made sure the data we were getting back was actually the right data to use in the decisions, and do it in a way that let us manage the applications of millions of people in a productive way. And frankly, that was just the start. I just kept getting project after project like that of wider scope where I got that opportunity to focus on how we could continue to improve, not the least of which was, frankly, after 9/11. A lot of my colleagues as well, but that really changed the trajectory I followed. So I would say that was the beginning of it all.
That's really exciting. I feel a kinship with you as a lawyer by training who's also jumped into the intersection of technology and homeland security issues. And so my beginnings are, sort of that 9/11 communications interoperability as well. I still have my support the D block buttons somewhere in a desk drawer around here. So, I definitely feel a lot of kinship there with you. With your extensive experience in cybersecurity and intelligence, counterterrorism, I'd love to see where you feel like AI's potential impacts in identifying and prioritizing mission-critical challenges is going to be potentially affecting our future.
Yeah, and I think there's sort of two ways of thinking about this. One is the use cases themselves that we're starting to see more and more of, and then the other part is your very important question, prioritizing when and how you take those on. I would say I'm seeing the world fall into sort of two main buckets. One are those aimed at how can we become more efficient at what we do and have greater impact more quickly. There are a number of projects, both in the administrative or support side, as well as the mission side, where we have existing programs, we have existing ways we do it. It's just the volume is so significant that we need to find better, smarter ways to move along faster. And that ranged from everything about how we do procurements to, frankly, how we do security checks on government and contractor personnel, all the way to, very mission-focused activities such as biometrics, which I'd love to talk about more as the show progresses, to just talk about how to approach that and how we've thought about that over, frankly, a very long period of time. In the prioritization area,
I'm excited to get into that with you. So, in your perfect world, what sort of things would you do to try to help prioritize? Like, what sort of factors should government agencies and decision makers be considering when they get into those sort of areas?
And my favorite question, I look at it as sort of a three-part element. First is, what are the use cases? What is the benefit? What are you trying to achieve? The second part is, how do you effectively manage risk? Especially any of us who came out of the security and especially Homeland Security space, we think of risk as a combination of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. If you can look at something and say, even though it has wide impact and the potential of a concern is significant, but I can mitigate the vulnerability or the consequence of to such a level, the benefits clearly outweigh any remaining residual risk. And then the last piece is just being in a space where you can effectively manage all of the activities you have under your umbrella as an agency. Which things go together effectively? Do I have the right amount of staff that are trained? Do I have a repeatable framework? All of those elements go to how to prioritize how many things you can do concurrently. And I see a lot of agencies start small, pick one or two, and proceed. But I also see agencies say, you know what, I really need to go for the big elements here because that is the make or break, would really change the trajectory my agency's on.
Have you seen any really successful implementations of this so far? I know some of it's fairly new, but that's starting to become less and less true with every passing day.
I will use biometrics actually as my example on biometrics at DHS in the travel context. This is my favorite one, not the least of which is because I've been working in and around it for, gosh, more than 20 years. So when I started in biometrics, it was not AI. But over the years, what we've seen is a real progression in how, frankly, the market has responded to government's needs, as well as private sector opportunities to make use of that progress. I will say, key elements that I saw that made it be that success was that real attention and thought to what is the use case. So in travel context, we needed to clearly be able to find a way to say, yes, this is either a new person that I need to run a security check on, or this is the same person I previously ran a check. How do I make sure it's actually the same person so that I'm assigning them the right level of screening or the right level of access to a space based on the fact that they are still the person I have conducted that check. So you had a clear, understood use case. Second part is that managing your vulnerabilities, right? So am I vulnerable to somebody interrupting my system? Am I vulnerable to potential, it looks like it's not really that person? Am I vulnerable for making a bad decision because of a mismatch? Over a long amount of time, DHS Science and Technology and the National Institutes of Standards and Technology have really done an amazing job in this space of grand challenges to advance facial recognition and fingerprint technologies in particular, so that you had a continual process that opened up, that vendors could submit their algorithms, that they get really granular results back to tell them you're doing well here, you're not doing well here, lets them adjust and retest in a way that is very hard otherwise, frankly, for private sector to do. And this is in large part because places like DHS, with our shared systems, shared data with the Department of State, so everybody who gets a visa, everybody who enters the country, we have one of the most diverse biometric sets to train and test against that anyone could possibly look to. So then the last piece through that is the incredible public-private collaboration we have seen as well. And I just want to emphasize both on the side that got us to having a mature set of technology vendors that keep evolving. Each round gets better and better. So much better than a human at this point, which is even so. Not only is it faster, not only do people like it. Recent study by US Travel found that 89% of people said they preferred the biometric match, where you don't have to pull out your boarding pass and your driver's license compared to the old way, as well as how it's been able to be adopted. And you're seeing this intersection with TSA, Customs and Border Protection, the airlines and the airports look for ways to use it to harmonize actual passenger journey across the entire, bag drop, boarding the plane. So it's just a better process. Security benefit and facilitation, quality on the biometric match, and people feel like their data is protected.
That example is really salient because it is such a nice success story to be able to tell with picture where we were a few years back with how TSA was doing it with the incredible lines and, the frustrations way up here. And, some of those technology interventions have really had quite a lot to do with it. And I think your point about the public-private partnership is really essential to sort of get the innovation and then also be able to install it for public use. From your perspective there, are you seeing elements of that collaboration that sort of create pillars of a framework that could be repeated in other agencies with different mission spaces?
Yeah, I obviously can give you the most examples out of the Homeland Security space. I would point in particular to Customs and Border Protection and CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agencies, as other places. Anytime you're talking about agencies such as TSA, CBP, and CISA, the government can just operate on its own. You are, by definition, interacting. So CBP might be not only interacting with travelers coming across the border, but all the companies who are in charge of the trade that crosses our border every day. When you talk about CISA, it's every critical infrastructure operator. The ability to have these exchanges, the ability to look for ways to set standards in places that need to have standards are all absolutely critical. I'll just point to one example back in TSA that I think is particularly helpful, where you can have a number of entities come together, agree on a set of requirements, right? And then you're able to use that to incentivize the market to come forward with solutions, and then have the agency or another repeatable entity conduct that testing for you, give that response back, just means there's a more mature set of vendors, technology options, and all of the entities, private sector, public sector, all benefit from having that very mature ecosystem.
Couldn't agree with you more. With the rapid pace of national security issues and the technology that is being developed to try to solve them, how can agencies balance the urgency of trying to figure out where AI can help drive those initiatives and the need for careful oversight and regulation?
My recommendation that you start with your problem statement. What are you actually trying to fix? What is the outcome you're trying to achieve? Where are you trying to go? AI may or may not actually be the right solution, or it may be the third step in an evolution, right? And the first step is, frankly, just some automation around some of the most manual pieces of processes. And once you are able to take that off the shoulders of your workforce, you'll suddenly have even better ideas of what that future state should look like. So first off, start with the business problem, start with what you need to do to improve the mission performance you have. The second thing I would then say is look for that way to analyze and assess risk in a repeatable, structured manner and build up, for lack of a better term, a governance process, a set of people, a set of individuals who represent all the right disciplines to come together, but they use a common set of framework and criteria to evaluate that risk, think about how to mitigate or manage the risk, but who are all at the end of the day committed to solving the business problem. If you can say, we're all here to get the mission done, people are really incredibly creative and innovative.
This has been more of a dynamic that we've been seeing at the state and local level, but somewhat at the federal side. The earlier stages, a couple of years back, when generative AI started really getting ahead of steam and got people really excited, we saw a lot of folks make procurement decisions, but it was sort of ramshackle. It was wild shot. They were grabbing it over here. There wasn't really much of a thought in terms of how it would all interoperate and what a governance structure would look like. Have you encountered anybody that has sort of made some of those mistakes of exuberance, let's call it, where they got really excited about something, they made a purchase decision, and then actually they had to back up and go, whoa, how do we fit this into our operations? This broke our governance model. What do we do?
I like that mistake of exuberance. That is a wonderful way of placing it. I would say the places I have seen are most likely to fall into some of those issues are ones that didn't already have some robust acquisition programs, technology programs, places who already focus on what is the data I have, how am I curating it, how am I protecting it, how am I making sure that I'm using it consistently. For those who had existing capital planning investment processes, they're less likely to have some of that, but not to say zero. Because to your point, right, the incentives in the market are, hey, cool, I've got this great new piece of tech. Don't you want to try it out? And people get really excited about, oh, yeah, this could be a game changer for my mission. I'll be able to do X, I'll be able to do Y, it'll take half the time, I'll find things I've never seen before. And making sure that your agency, your organization has a way to channel both that energy and a way to channel what you're testing and how you're trying it. I am a big believer in trying things out, but you have to go into it with the idea of, I know what problem I'm going to solve. I have a way to measure whether or not I'm actually successful against it. I'm not just, oh, cool, I deployed a tool. Great, I'm done. No, is that tool actually achieving the goal I set? And then I have a way to update from there. And probably the last piece that is the place I often see people get most sideways is they get so focused on the tool deployment that they forget that there are humans interacting with the tool, and they don't spend sufficient time training the humans on how to interpret the results that are coming back. In particular, where I've seen AI might give a score back, how likely is this a match? If you don't tell somebody 23% is essentially not a match, they think they have to use it. And you have to tell them, yeah, if it's 98%, you're good. If it's 23%, ignore it. Here's the place where I want you to actually spend your time and attention evaluating the results and then use your human judgment to make a decision. But if you don't tell the person that and train with them on it, you get some very interesting results.
I can only imagine, it doesn't require too much of an imagination in a Homeland Security space to interpret a technical result with an untrained user and just imagine what happens that goes from there. You and I have made our careers on trying to help that. And so, yeah, your point is very well taken.
I won't say which agency it was, but very early in my career, I remember a time when I was working in a specific field. We were deploying a tool and we had just changed that user interface, but what we presented back to the user. And I was being interviewed by the GAO about how we had done it. And they noted that the agency, the actual users of the information, were very disappointed. We had taken away certain information. They couldn't see something. And I nicely said, yes, because they weren't using it right. So no, we're not giving it back to them. And GAO did laugh and go, okay, that makes sense. Like they weren't understanding. It wasn't a match. Or they thought it meant the data was wrong as opposed to understanding, no, they had an imposter in front of them.
Right. The models functioning perfectly can still create confusion from time to time if you understand how the model is treating the information and what the outputs mean, for sure. In a space where you have a sort of decision maker who's looking at whether or not AI is a potential solution that they want to explore, have you noticed any sort of common trends among the sort of problem types that are particularly conducive to an AI type solution?
Yeah, the ones that I've seen work best are where there's a very large set of data sets to start with. And then secondarily, one that there's a lot of data about what you're trying to find or the problem you're trying to identify. So, for example, when you're talking about trade data coming to the United States, we have a lot of information about the movement of money, drugs, and weapons in shipments and in mail. The ability to use that sort of very diverse data set with a lot of anomalous behavior lets you much more rapidly, I think, identify and train an algorithm. Being able to curate, understand what your data is good at telling you, what are the things that are perhaps far and few in between in your data, therefore the algorithm isn't going to be particularly predictive about it, isn't critically important, right? So for example, mean time to failure for critical pieces of equipment. The machines TSA uses at the airport to scan carry-on bags all the way to helicopter for the Department of Defense. Important to understand how likely is it, how fast will it be before a piece is likely to fail or a subcomponent. There's a lot of data on that. That's a great use case. Similarly, TSA has a lot of data around what's in bags and how it differs in Miami versus Chicago. being able to use that information in a way that is structured and thoughtful, and then you're able to not only identify where the algorithms need additional training or where you might need additional information to fill in a gap, but then also looking at, is it not just reliably identifying the things I'm telling it to look for, but what other elements is it identifying, and do those make sense? Is that actually an anomaly? I've seen instances where use of technology was suddenly identifying all iPads as bad. That's obviously not correct, but the idea that something could be an electronic device is in fact a known threat stream. So, making sure that you are watching the results both in your testing and in your operations, see what it tells you, make sure that makes sense, do the additional digging to understand why it's telling you that, and then think through how to handle that information from there.
Certainly, problems that have large data sets, as you are describing, are very conducive to that. One of the things that is a risk that comes up with those large data sets, though, are controlling for things like unintended bias and whatnot. How have you seen that sort of philosophical tension between keeping the innovation going, but not getting so far out ahead of yourself that things like bias and civil liberties violations get caught up in the chaff? Where have you seen agencies really wrestling with that sort of philosophical tension?
Pretty much every agency I know is not only aware of that tension, but very mindful of it, especially in the security sector, and especially in the Homeland Security sector, because we're so public facing. I know very early, right as we were becoming DHS, I was working on some of the early on privacy impact assessments and notices explaining new programs and processes, right? So when you have that mindset, when you've had to think about how am I going to explain this to the public? How do I explain what the machine is? How do I explain what the process is? What are they most worried about? How do I tell them the information, not only that's useful to them, but what to do if they see there's a problem? A lot of that translates very nicely into this space. The same things they were worried about when it was manual are the same things they're still worried about. How am I confident that the government will not have a significant derogatory interaction with me based on a misunderstanding of data or information? That issue is not new. It's just how we get there that's new. That's number one. Number two, though, I would say is I'm very excited about actually the opportunity to use AI to understand biases in data. The fact that it can tell you have a very significant amount of information around X, Y, or Z, but here you have such limited numbers. And if you think about, they're two very different tools, right? The tool to find stuff versus the tool to tell you have a limited data set against which to draw conclusions. That in and of itself, I think, is a really exciting opportunity space in AI.
I really like your point too about the public communication element of it, especially with very public facing mission spaces, because you have the sort of philosophical tension. There's the technical issues associated with it, but then you also have to communicate this stuff to the public. And with AI, we've just seen a lot of people struggling mightily with the idea of what's a real risk and fear versus some AI boogeyman, Terminator, Skynet kind of situation. And I think that some of those fears are fairly unrealistic, but the actual significant fears, they're a little more nuanced. It's a little less obvious because there's not some great sci-fi thriller that we can all point to say, oh, this is what we're so nervous about. But like a hyper intelligent, non-sentient algorithm with access to massive data might be able to draw conclusions about you that you're not even aware of, but are very accurate. And I mean, that definitely feels like much more of a realistic scenario to be sort of nervous about. And then that's where so how do you communicate that to the public? And what is the governance structure for a device that big? Because if it's able to know things about you that you don't know, that could create a risk. I mean, I'm thinking of situations where, people are getting pushed ads for pregnancy items and then they find out a month later they're pregnant. It's like, how did that happen? That's way scarier than a machine suddenly becoming sentient and deciding we're all enemies. Like that just doesn't feel very realistic these days.
Yes, the concerns about what a surveillance society would look like are not illegitimate or unfounded, right? We've seen other countries struggle with this. I am glad we are people here in the United States who are focused on how do we use information effectively and how do we put the appropriate guardrails and controls over it to make sure it's heading in the right place. You've hit a great one. Airports, I think people generally recognize that they are covered entirely with CCTV. Yet we still have people going up and doing very interesting things directly on TV, right? So I'm always sort of surprised if some people are very focused on and understand where the coverage is and the limitations. Others just are not. But to that point, I think this is an area where I would love to see continued progress and thought. Some of the most exciting tools or discussions I've had around some of the use cases are more aimed at, we have this incredible wealth of CCTV, starting obviously post 9/11, but even picking up speed after that with such things as the Boston Marathon bombing. What you don't have is anywhere near sufficient people to be able to go through any of it real time. And so the idea that you could get to a better space to look for what is the actual anomalous behavior I actually need a human to look at, and which stuff nobody needs to look at and should be generally not accessible would be, or only accessible upon later, like there's an incident and I need to go back and look, are critically important. And that could be anything from, in an airport, that person shouldn't be going through that door. They're heading out to the tarmac. They shouldn't be there, right? To my personal favorite, anytime you talk about mass transit systems, yes, we always have a concern about a potential for someone leaving a bomb on the tracks, but we're frankly just as concerned about someone who may be considering suicide. And you want to be able to identify very quickly, if to be able to vector law enforcement in to make sure that you help rescue somebody in those kind of circumstances. There's a lot of those type of use cases where I think you could actually be more privacy and protective of us as on an individual basis if we had some additional tools in the space.
I totally agree with you there. One of the common themes that you were raising, though, is that sort of human in the loop as one of the main protective measures, having the decisions sort of flow through a human, with the AI providing all of the factors for consideration and analysis. Have you seen other strategies in addition to human in the loop that have been providing any value?
Yeah, and this goes to, I do actually think a secondary AI who's looking for specific problem areas can be also one of your good fail-safe systems, and in some ways might be further assistance to the humans. Humans who get used to a certain level of repetition and things generally going well, you become less attuned to a potential problem over time when you just don't see it very often, right? So I'll keep using TSA examples. This is why we actually see TSA test its officers, because the actual number of bombs coming through a checkpoint is very low. So we need to test them with test artifacts so that they don't become, just inured to the idea that something might be happening. But the flip side of this in the space we're talking about is, how could you use a secondary AI to be the one that's continually probing and checking, to look for those anomalies or outliers, to look for something that isn't behaving. So it's specifically looking for the problem as opposed to being in the system that's performing the activity.
Aside from giving that sort of model or that algorithm, different parameters, maybe a slightly different training set, what other mechanisms would you say would be necessary in order for that sort of system to go? Because it's very interesting having a machine checking a machine, and it seems pretty interesting when you still have a human in the loop going, okay, is all of this making sense, or like, are they hallucinating together?
Yes, because it sounds close enough to right. It's within sort of your immediate expected corners, but it's not actually behaving fully in an expected way, right? So some of that is back again to, can you get the right training data set in order to build the algorithm that would enable it to do it? The secondary piece is, how do I make sure that it's being adapted based on the threat streams and changes in how the threat actors may be trying to take advantage of the system? Coming out of the space that I do, we spent a lot of time trying to make sure that we had not only closed up the gap last exploited, or what we were seeing the bad actors talk about trying to do, but also have a realistic way of looking at, well, okay, what else could happen that's like this, even if I don't exactly see it in the intelligence threat traffic, but is within the parameters that make sense. You can't go after every single possible threat that any of us could dream up. It's back to, you need to prioritize. But there are ways that you can think that through in a logical way and sort of make sure that you're continuing to build either synthetic data to help identify what types of anomaly, but other ways of helping prepare algorithms to be mindful of that might be in your space. The last piece I would just say is back to again, and the human overseeing that process. I think we're all very used to the idea that if you're logging into a national security system, there is a log, and a human does at the end of the day look at anomalous behavior. Well, what's something else is flagging what's the anomalous behavior, and then the human says, yep, no, given their job and the project they're working on, I know this is not what they normally do, but it does make sense here. Or no, that's clearly a violation of the terms of use. They should have their system access removed.
That's really interesting. I always appreciate when a completely new perspective shows up on the show, and having that sort of three-legged stool that's fairly new. I've not heard that one before, so it's very intriguing. Like I said, I always appreciate when some really new, genuine thought makes it into the show. That's great. I'd like to shift gears just a little bit and get into some of the regulatory frameworks. We talk a lot on our show here about the sort of sensitivity between wanting to not get in the way of innovation, but not letting it run completely rampant because there might be a lot of harms there. And so we have sort of a nice dichotomy right now. The EU just passed its big omnibus AI law that's very prescriptive. And then you have sort of the history with the United States around how we started doing regulation more around like the .com bubble, which is a little bit more laissez-faire. Let's see where this goes and only step in once we've got clearly identified issues. Would love to get your perspective on factors that agencies should be considering and sort of what approach would go and like where do you put your thumb on the scales of regulation versus innovation?
And to that point, my perspective is very much sort of baked in my history of regulations in the federal government. As a general rule, I look to regulations, frankly, to be a floor. It's a way to ensure that nobody is a free rider on the security everybody else is providing. I think we've seen some pretty notable examples where someone sort of tries to skate by and not protect their systems or not watch out for the behavior of what they're doing, cause harm well beyond their users, their company. The Colonial Pipeline with the cyber ransomware attack a few years ago, I think being a great example, right? They didn't actually stop the system or harm the system, but the shutdown in order to avoid the ransomware had this enormous cascading effect. So my belief is very much around you need a level of regulation that sets the floor, that protects from that type of follow-on collateral damage, protects the people who might be impacted by those actions. You also want to very much aim your efforts at how to incentivize the right outcomes. And sometimes the right outcome cannot be dictated in the language of a regulation that tends to be pretty prescriptive. I've seen a number of agencies try to focus more on here's the outcome we're trying to seek, here's a way you can do it, but then say you are able to ask the agency if you have a better way to reach the same outcome for approval of your measures. So TSA and FAA actually have some fantastic authorities in this space where they can go back and forth, receive alternative measures from the regulated entity to achieve that outcome. And I think that's an incredibly healthy approach. There's other places that don't have a lot of regulatory authority today, and so they've tried to do as much as they can through guidelines, through that public-private partnership of how do we all agree on a right direction to go. But it is harder when you don't have the opportunity at the end of the day to have that backstop, to have that floor. But you do always want to make sure people don't go, okay, great, check the box. I don't have to do more, or think I can't go beyond because then the regulatory agency will find me non-compliance. And those are sort of some of the elements I've seen come through. Just one last thought in that space. I've been really excited to watch how many of the recent moves by the administration, by NIST, across several federal agencies. DHS has been quite public with how they're talking about this, how they're approaching it. Every agency is now posting their use cases of where they're trying things out on their website so the public can see what are you trying, how are you trying it, what does that look like? The fact that that framework about how do you think about risk and how do you incentivize in specific areas, especially with NIST playing such a big role, I think is incredibly positive and will really move the needle.
Well said. I couldn't agree more. With regards to like standard setting and standard setting bodies, some of those are governmental and some of those are more industry specific. A really full court press on some of the standard settings also seems like a really good way to get industry involved. My thought on it has always been we want to make sure that there's governmental regulator presence on all of those standard setting boards because they have a really important perspective. It's an important voice to make sure is represented. But in the sort of tension between open and proprietary standards, where do you think that also sits? Because you can sort of see some arguments on both sides where really pushing the needle on some of this stuff might require some proprietary back end foo, but the open standards definitely provide more public assurance that product, your service, your algorithm, whatever is doing what you say it's doing because it's open. Anybody can audit it. You can pull back the covers and see what's going on there.
I would say I agree with you. There's sort of a time and space for both, right? And I almost see it on a maturity curve. So in the early days around particular problem sets or particular areas or particular technology, I think you're more likely to and more comfortable with having something more proprietary because you don't know enough yet to set an industry-wide standard. You have to have a lot more information. Otherwise, the standard you'd set, you might go through a huge amount of effort and then it not really be used. But over time, you want to say, and I know when I was in government or now with a large firm, I want a mature market where I have a lot of different options that I can guarantee a level of performance. And I know we'll actually work together if I take some of A and part of B. That requires a common standard. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And this is an area I actually just talked about this last week when we were talking about, for example, how to have a better aviation passenger journey. The ability, we're seeing huge numbers of tools flourish right now, everything from how many, different places I can go check what are my air flight opportunities, routing, pricing, everything else, to where am I going to stay, to how do I get point A to point B. It all requires the human right now to be the integrator across all of it, and down to and including, my personal number one frustration. If someone would fix this, I would be a fan forever, is why can I have wayfinding on my phone that gets me from my house to the airport, but I can't have it go all the way to the gate, including the timing updates when the plane's delayed. And I want a number of those. So I'm not just tied into only one company, right? And I wouldn't want that one company to be the one to even be the one collecting or aggregating all that information. I'd like it to be that one company using standard information sharing that is appropriate and protected and tested and cyber secure. But they can say, okay, this I'm going to get from company A and this part I'm going to get from company B. I will make it look seamless to the human as the user interface. But it doesn't have to be one size fits all. And I know, in the early movement into new areas, companies like to be that holistic all-in-one, and it is hard to get them to go from that into that wider space. But I hope people see that just shows how important that market has become, how important that offering has become, and what is that old rule? As long as the pie keeps growing, your share, even you might decrease the percentage points, but the total benefit will continue to grow.
This is always like, how did Paul Allen feel about owning 3% of Microsoft? Pretty darn good would be my guess.
Yes, exactly. Perfect example.
We're about out of time, and I always like to give my guests sort of the last word here. The question I always ask, what piece of key advice would you offer to policymakers and decision makers who are trying to identify those mission-critical challenges that AI can address?
100% back to the earlier point, public-private partnership. Not only talk with the entities that are potentially in the market, who are the ones potentially working on the technology themselves, because you need a really wide understanding of what's the state of the market, what are their concerns are, but frankly, also who are the end entities you are interacting with, right? So whether it's the travel industry or, or the trade industry or every company in America who has a cyber problem or is at risk from a cyber, a critical infrastructure, figuring out where the commonalities across your interests are so that you can together look at how do I say, not just this one procurement, how do I pick the right thing and then implement it well, although that is hugely important. But frankly, how do I make sure that I am incentivizing the right set of standards, of growth, of outcomes that will help us against the various security threats we face over the next decade? And that all, frankly, security is a team sport. We have to all work on this together.
Thank you so much, Patty, for all of your wisdom and sage advice today. Really appreciate all of your insights, a lot of information for us and our users to digest. And to all of the users out there, thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.